The resume shook in her hands. Not much, just enough for the paper to whisper against itself, a small dry sound in a room that had gone very quiet. She had read the name on the door twice before she walked in. She had read the name on the folder in the receptionist's hand once more, just to be sure her eyes weren't lying to her. And now she sat across a wide glass desk from the man who was going to decide whether she got this job. And she understood, in the space of about 4 seconds, that the last 5 years of her life had led her back to exactly the person she had walked out on. He hadn't looked up yet. He was still reading her application, his pen resting against the edge of a legal pad, his jaw set in the particular stillness of a man giving nothing away. And then he lifted his eyes. The room went silent in a way that had nothing to do with sound. If you have ever wondered what it looks like when the past finally sends the bill, stay with this one until the end, because this story is about to show you. 5 years earlier, the apartment on Larkspur Street had one working burner on the stove and a crib wedged into the corner of a room that was supposed to be a home office. Daniel Reyes stood in that kitchen at 2 in the morning, holding a bottle at an angle he'd learned from a video, watching his daughter's eyes fight sleep and lose. He was 29 years old. He had a degree in structural engineering that he wasn't using, and a wife who had left 4 days earlier with 2 suitcases and no explanation beyond a note that said she wasn't built for this. He hadn't argued with the note. Looks. There was nothing in it to argue with. It was a statement of fact. And Daniel had learned by then that arguing with facts was a waste of time, better spent solving the problem in front of him. The problem in front of him was a daughter named Ellie, 11 weeks old, and a checking account with $240 in it. He got a job within the week. Not the job he wanted. A job at a construction firm doing site inspections. The kind of work that paid by the hour and asked no questions about why a man showed up to work looking like he hadn't slept, because none of them had either. He brought Ellie to his sister's apartment before his shift and picked her up after, and in between, he learned how to read a blueprint the way other men read a newspaper, cover to cover, looking for what didn't belong. He was good at it. Better than good. He had a way of looking at a set of drawings and finding the one detail that didn't sit right, the beam spec that didn't match the load calculation, the foundation depth that had been quietly revised without anyone updating the file that mattered. It wasn't a talent so much as a discipline. He checked things twice. He checked them a third time when something in his gut told him to, and his gut was rarely wrong. 5 years is a long time to build something out of nothing. He didn't build it quickly, and he didn't build it by accident. He took night classes, 2 semesters at a time, whatever his sister could cover for childcare, whatever he could manage on 4 hours of sleep. He moved from site inspector to project engineer, and from project engineer to the kind of quiet, meticulous specialist that firms call in when something has gone wrong and nobody can figure out why. He built a reputation the same way he built everything else, slowly and without shortcuts. By the time Ellie was starting kindergarten, Daniel Reyes had a name in structural consulting circles that meant something. Careful, thorough, impossible to rush, and impossible to fool. By the time she was in 2nd grade, he had been recruited by Halbrook & Voss, a mid-sized engineering and construction firm with a growing book of commercial contracts, to run their structural review division. By the time she was 8, he was its chief executive officer. That last part hadn't been the plan. Nobody plans to become the head of a company they joined as a consultant 3 years earlier. But the previous chief executive, an aging man named Arthur Voss, who had inherited the firm from his father, had watched Daniel work through 2 structural crises that would have bankrupted the company under anyone else's judgment, and had made a decision that surprised the entire board. Arthur Voss had called Daniel into his office on a Tuesday afternoon and asked him a single question: "Do you tell the truth even when it costs you something?" Daniel had said yes. Arthur had nodded, slid a folder across the desk, and said that was the only qualification that had ever mattered to him, and that everyone else in the building seemed to have forgotten it. 3 months later, Daniel Reyes was CEO, and Arthur Voss stayed on as chairman of the board, close enough to watch, far enough to let the younger man run the company his own way. Daniel ran it the way he did everything else. Quietly, methodically. He kept his door open more than closed, which unsettled the executives who were used to closed doors, and he asked more questions than he answered, which unsettled the ones who were used to being told what to think. He picked Ellie up from school himself twice a week, blocked it into his calendar like any other meeting, and told his assistant that block was not to be touched for anything short of the building being on fire. He did not talk about his ex-wife, not to his daughter, who was too young to ask the right questions yet, and not to his colleagues, who had learned early that Daniel Reyes's personal life was a locked door. Nobody knocked on twice. Her name was Vanessa. She had not thought about Daniel much in the first year after she left. That was the truth, the plain and unflattering truth, and if she had been asked to explain herself back then, she would have said something about needing to find out who she was, outside of motherhood, outside of a marriage that had started too young and asked too much too fast. She had gone to stay with a college friend in another state. She had taken a marketing job. She had for a while believed that the itch she'd been feeling for 2 years was the itch of a life not yet lived, and that satisfying it would settle something in her chest that had been rattling since the day the pregnancy test came back positive. It did not settle. If anything, it rattled louder, because a life not yet lived turns out to be a strange kind of freedom when there's no one waiting for you to come home. She moved twice more. She dated a man who turned out to be married, and another who turned out to be broke in ways he'd hidden well. And by the 3rd year, she had stopped telling people in her life that she had a daughter because the conversation that followed was always the same, and she was tired of watching people's faces change. The marketing job ended. When the company folded, the next one paid less. The one after that paid less still, and came with a manager 11 years younger than her, who used words like synergy without any apparent irony. And Vanessa had sat in her car in the parking lot after her first week and cried in a way she hadn't let herself cry since the divorce papers were finalized. Because somewhere in the last 4 years, she had gone from being a woman looking for herself to being a woman who had misplaced herself and couldn't remember where. She thought about Daniel more in that 4th year than she had in the previous 3 combined, not with longing, exactly, with something closer to arithmetic. A quiet, involuntary calculation of what her life might look like now if she had stayed, set against what her life actually looked like, and the answer the calculation kept returning was not one she enjoyed sitting with. She found out what he'd become by accident, the way people usually find out things they've spent years actively not looking for. A former college roommate posted an article. A regional business journal had run a profile on rising firms in the construction and engineering sector, and Halbrook and Voss was featured for its handling of a major bridge retrofit project that had come in under budget and ahead of schedule despite a supply chain crisis that had crippled half the industry. There was a photograph. Daniel, standing in a hard hat on a job site, half smiling at something outside the frame, looking older in a way that had nothing to do with wrinkles and everything to do with the particular weight men carry, when they've spent years being the only adult in the room. The caption named him as Chief Executive Officer. Vanessa had read the article 4 times. Not because the words were complicated, because some part of her brain kept expecting them to rearrange themselves into something she could argue with. The way his note 5 years ago had been something you couldn't argue with. And this was the same, just inverted, a fact. Sitting there, refusing to move. She thought about reaching out. She decided against it, and then reconsidered, and then decided against it again, cycling through the decision for the better part of 2 months, while her current job circled a layoff that everyone in the office could feel, coming the way you feel, a storm before the sky changes color. The layoff came in early spring, 40 people let go in a single afternoon, a conference room full of nervous employees waiting to hear whether their name would be called. And Vanessa's name was called. She spent 6 weeks applying to jobs that didn't call back. She spent 4 more weeks applying to jobs that called back and then didn't offer. Her savings, never large to begin with, thin to the point where the rent conversation with her landlord became a monthly negotiation rather than an automatic transfer. It was a recruiter, not her own initiative, who first mentioned Halbrook and Voss. The firm was expanding its client relations division and needed someone with marketing and communications experience. The recruiter had no idea who ran the company and no reason to make the connection to a name. Vanessa hadn't spoken aloud in years. She almost said no. She sat with her phone in her hand for 11 minutes, the recruiter's message open on the screen, and told herself that Daniel Reyes ran a company with hundreds of employees, that CEOs did not personally interview candidates for a client relations coordinator role, that the odds of ever being in a room with him were close enough to zero to round down. She said yes, because she was 3 weeks from being unable to make rent, and pride, she had learned, was a luxury item, and she had sold most of hers off already, just trying to survive the last 5 years. The interview was scheduled for a Thursday morning. She spent the 2 days before it rehearsing answers to standard questions, printing her resume on heavy paper because someone online had said it made an impression, and practicing a handshake that projected confidence she did not currently possess in any quantity. She did not know, walking into the lobby of Halbrook and Voss, that the position had been elevated. She did not know that the hiring manager who was originally slated to conduct the interview had been pulled into an unrelated crisis that morning, a material certification issue on a downtown high-rise that needed the CEO's direct attention, and that Daniel, reviewing the day's schedule to reshuffle his calendar around the crisis, had simply told his assistant to route the client relations interview to him directly, since he happened to have the 11 o'clock slot open. He had not looked at the candidate's name before agreeing. He rarely did. Names meant nothing to him until a face and a voice attached themselves to the words on the page, and by the time he glanced down at the resume in front of him, the receptionist had already shown the candidate in and closed the door. He read the name first. Vanessa Cole. His pen stopped moving. He told himself in the 2 or 3 seconds before he lifted his head that Cole was not an uncommon surname, and that a coincidence was still statistically more likely than the alternative, and that he had built an entire career on not jumping to conclusions before the evidence was in front of him. Then he looked up, and the evidence was in front of him, sitting 3 feet away in a blazer that didn't quite fit right anymore. Her hands folded so tightly around a folder of paperwork that her knuckles had gone pale. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Daniel set his pen down with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything else. He had learned, over 5 years of solving other people's problems, that the instinct to fill silence with words was usually the instinct that got you into trouble. So he didn't fill it. He let it sit there, between them, doing whatever work silence does in a room like that. It was Vanessa who broke it, because she couldn't not. "I didn't know," she said. The recruiter never said. "I would never have." "I believe you," Daniel said. 3 words. Flat, not unkind, closing the door on the apology before it could become a longer conversation. Neither of them had the footing for, yet he looked back down at the resume. Not because he needed to read it again, but because it gave his eyes somewhere to be that wasn't her face. And because some habits, the habit of processing a hard thing by reading it multiple times, run deeper than the moment that triggers them. Client relations experience. 4 years, 2 employers, both mid-tier firms in industries that had nothing to do with construction. A marketing certification from a community college. A gap of 5 months unexplained between her second-to-last job and her current unemployment. He read it a second time. The facts didn't change. They rarely did. "How's Ellie?" Vanessa asked, and her voice cracked slightly on the name, the way a plank cracks under weight it hasn't been asked to bear in a long time. "She's good," Daniel said. "She's 8. I know how old she is." It came out sharper than she meant it to, and she seemed to hear it land the way he did, because she looked down at her hands immediately after. Daniel didn't respond to that either. He wasn't in the business of scoring points off a woman who was visibly one bad afternoon away from falling apart in his office, and he had never been in that business, not even in the months right after she left, when scoring points would have felt, briefly, like justice. He asked her the standard questions. Where had she worked? What had she done there? Why did she want this role? He listened to her answers the same way he listened to a contractor explaining a schedule delay, watching for the places where the story didn't quite match the paperwork, not because he wanted to catch her in something, but because that was simply how his mind worked, sorting information into columns of solid and unverified whether he wanted it to or not. Her answers were honest, as far as he could tell, painfully honest. In places, the kind of honesty that comes from a person who has run out of the energy required to perform. "Why should I hire you?" he asked finally, and it wasn't cruelty in his voice, just the question, asked the way he'd ask it of anyone. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You shouldn't, if the reason has to be that I deserve it. I don't know that I do. But I'm good at the parts of this job that don't have anything to do with the last 5 years. I know how to manage a client relationship. I know how to write in a way that doesn't sound like it came out of a manual. And I need this. In a way I'm not proud of, but I'm not going to pretend otherwise to make it sound better." It was the most honest answer she'd given all morning. Possibly the most honest thing she'd said out loud in longer than that, and Daniel recognized honesty when he heard it because he'd spent his whole adult life being suspicious of everything that wasn't. He didn't answer her right away. He closed the folder, squared its edges against the desk with 2 fingers, and looked at her for a moment in a way that wasn't unkind and wasn't warm either. It was the look. He gave a blueprint when he'd found the thing that didn't sit right and was deciding what to do about it. "I'll be in touch," he said. "Someone from Human Resources will follow up either way, regardless of the outcome. That's how we do things here." It was a corporate answer, and they both understood it as a door closing gently rather than slamming, and Vanessa stood, thanked him in a voice that had lost most of its air, and left the office without looking back. Daniel sat at his desk for a long time after she'd gone. He didn't call anyone. He didn't reach for his phone or the next item on his schedule. He looked at the closed door for the better part of 2 minutes, and in that time he thought, briefly and without indulgence, about a kitchen with 1 working burner and a note on a counter, and a version of himself that had been so tired he'd stopped being able to tell the difference between angry and sad. He was not that version of himself anymore. That was, he understood, the entire point of the last 5 years. He picked up his phone and called Marcus Webb, his head of human resources, and one of the few people at the firm he considered a genuine friend rather than a colleague he tolerated. Marcus had been with the company under Arthur Voss and had stayed on when Daniel took over, largely because Daniel had never once asked him to bend a policy for someone's convenience, and Marcus, in 18 years of corporate human resources, had learned to value that trait in a leader above almost every other one. "I need you to run a candidate through the standard process," Daniel said. "No shortcuts, no fast track. Whatever the actual hiring committee would do with any other applicant for the client relations role, do that." "Something I should know," Marcus asked, because Marcus had also learned in 18 years to hear the things Daniel wasn't saying. "It's personal," Daniel said, "which is exactly why I want it handled like it isn't." Marcus didn't push. He said he'd loop in the hiring committee that had been assembled for the role before the schedule shuffled onto Daniel's desk. 3 mid-level managers from client services and 1 from communications, none of whom had any idea who Vanessa Cole was or why the CEO had taken a personal interest in the process being clean. That was the point. Daniel wanted her judged on the merits, whatever those merits turned out to be, by people who had no stake in either punishing her or protecting her. It took 10 days. In those 10 days, Vanessa went through 2 more interviews with the hiring committee, a written assessment testing her communication skills, and a reference check on her 2 most recent employers, one of whom gave a lukewarm but not damning account of her performance, and the other of whom, her most recent manager before the layoff, said flatly that she'd been one of the more reliable people on a team that had otherwise been a mess, and that letting her go had been about budget, not performance. The hiring committee's assessment came back with a recommendation to hire, not enthusiastic, but solid. Competent. A safe pair of hands for a role that mostly required steadiness rather than brilliance. Marcus brought the file to Daniel's office on the 10th day and set it on the desk without comment. Daniel read it once. Then he read it again. More slowly, the way he read every document that mattered, looking for the thing that might be sitting quietly beneath the surface of the words, the load calculation that didn't match the drawing. There wasn't one. It was a clean file, a modest, honest recommendation. For a modest, honest hire. "You going to approve it?" Marcus asked. "It's not my decision to approve or deny," Daniel said. "That's the committee's job. I asked for a clean process. I got one. My personal feelings don't belong in it." Marcus studied him for a moment. "That's a very generous line to hold, given the circumstances." "It's not generosity," Daniel said. It's the same rule I hold for every hire in this building. If I bend it for her because of who she is to me, I have to ask myself whether I'd bend it the other direction too, and I won't do either." He signed the approval where the process required his signature, as a formality. For any executive track hire, a signature that meant nothing more than confirmation that the proper steps had been followed, and slid the file back across the desk to Marcus. It was, Daniel would think later, one of the more meaningful signatures he'd put his name to in 5 years. Not because of what it changed, but because of what it proved he hadn't let it change. Vanessa started the following Monday. She was placed 2 floors below Daniel's office, in a client relations pod with 4 other coordinators, under a manager named Patricia Ames, who had been with Halbrook and Voss for 6 years and who ran her department with the specific, brittle confidence of a person who has spent a long time overcompensating for something. Patricia Ames did not like Vanessa from the first week, for reasons that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with instinct, the kind of low territorial instinct that some people carry toward anyone who seems capable of being noticed by someone above them. It didn't help that word had gotten around, in the quiet, half-confirmed way that things get around in office buildings, that the new coordinator had some connection to the CEO. Nobody knew the details. Marcus had kept the file closed, and Daniel had said nothing to anyone beyond the necessary instructions, to Marcus himself. But offices run on rumor the way engines run on fuel, and the rumor that circulated, distorted by the time it reached the 4th retelling, was that Vanessa Cole had been hand-picked, favored, slipped into the building through a side door that ordinary employees didn't get to use. Patricia Ames heard the rumor and decided without evidence that it was true, and decided further that the appropriate response was to make Vanessa's first months as difficult as professionally possible in 100 small ways that never quite rose to the level of anything actionable. Vanessa was assigned the clients nobody else wanted. She was left off meeting invitations that affected her own accounts, and then quietly blamed when she seemed uninformed in front of those same clients. Her reports were returned for revision over formatting issues that hadn't been flagged in anyone else's work. It was a slow, deliberate erosion, the kind that doesn't announce itself as hostility because it's built entirely out of things that are, technically, within a manager's discretion. Vanessa said nothing about it to anyone. She had learned across 5 hard years that complaining rarely fixed anything and often made things worse, and she had no interest in giving anyone in that building a reason to say she'd used her connection to the CEO to solve her problems. She didn't know, in fact, that Daniel was watching any of this until the 9th week, when Marcus Webb sat down across from him with a folder of employee feedback surveys that were collected quarterly across every department, as a matter of standard practice, unrelated, on paper, to any individual employee. "Client Relations Pod 2 has a problem," Marcus said. "Been building for a while. I want to flag it before it turns into something we have to explain to legal." Daniel took the folder and read through the anonymized comments. Several coordinators, not just Vanessa, described a working environment under Patricia Ames that had become, in the words of one respondent, exhausting in ways that had nothing to do with the actual workload. Favoritism toward employees who socialized with Patricia outside of work. Punitive scheduling for anyone who pushed back. A pattern, sketched faintly across a dozen different comments, of a manager who ran her team less like a coordinator of talent and more like a fiefdom. One comment, unsigned like the rest, but written in a voice Daniel recognized without needing a name attached to it, described being held to a different standard than colleagues doing identical work, without ever being told why, and being unable to raise the issue without risking the one job she currently had. Daniel read that comment 3 times. He did not act on instinct. He had spent 5 years training himself out of the instinct to act on anything before the evidence was fully assembled, and he was not going to abandon that discipline now, of all moments when the stakes for getting it wrong ran in 2 directions at once. If he intervened, and he was wrong, he'd be exactly the favoritism the rumors already accused him of. If he didn't intervene and he was right, he'd be exactly the kind of executive he'd spent his career despising, the kind who let the people below him rot a department because looking closely was inconvenient. "Pull the full performance data for that pod," he told Marcus. "Every coordinator. Assignment distribution, meeting attendance records, review turnaround times over the last 2 quarters. I want facts, not the survey. The survey tells us where to look. It doesn't tell us what we'll find. It took Marcus 4 days to compile it. The data, once assembled, told a clean and ugly story. Client assignments within Pod 2 were not distributed anything close to evenly by workload or complexity. 2 coordinators, both of whom had been photographed at a birthday dinner with Patricia Ames that had circulated on an internal social channel, received a disproportionate share of the pod's easier, higher visibility accounts. Tree, Vanessa Cole, and one other coordinator, a man named Ruiz, who had been with the company less than a year, absorbed the majority of the difficult, low-visibility accounts, the ones prone to client complaints regardless of who managed them, and both had been excluded from client strategy meetings for accounts that were technically still theirs. Review turnaround times told their own story too. Vanessa's reports averaged 11 days for manager sign-off. The pod average for everyone else was 3. Daniel sat with the data for a long time. He thought about Ellie briefly, the way he sometimes did when a decision in front of him touched something close to fairness, because fairness was the one value he'd made sure to model for her every single day since she was old enough to understand what the word meant. He thought about what it would mean to her someday if she learned her father had looked at proof like this and decided it was easier not to look. He called Patricia Ames into his office the following morning. She came in with the confidence of a manager who had run her department for 6 years without serious incident, dressed sharply, expecting a conversation about budget or headcount, the ordinary business of a Tuesday. Daniel didn't waste time on preamble. He was not a man who enjoyed making people uncomfortable, but he had also learned that softening a hard conversation rarely made it kinder, just longer. I've reviewed the performance data for your pod over the last 2 quarters, he said, and slid a printed summary across the desk. I want you to look at the assignment distribution and review turnaround columns specifically. Patricia looked. Her expression didn't change immediately, which told Daniel something in itself. Workloads shift, she said. Some coordinators handle certain account types better than others. That's just management. Ruiz and Cole are absorbing 60% of the pod's difficult accounts on 30% of its favorable review times, Daniel said. That's not workload variance, that's a pattern. With respect, Patricia said, and her voice took on the particular smoothness Daniel had heard from a dozen people over the years right before they told him something untrue. I don't think it's appropriate for you to be reviewing individual performance data at this level. That's what I have a director for. If this is about Vanessa specifically, I think we both know there might be reasons this feels sensitive to you that have nothing to do with her actual output. It was a well-aimed sentence. Daniel recognized the aim of it, the attempt to reframe the entire conversation as his conflict of interest, rather than her conduct, and he let a short silence sit after she said it, the same silence he'd let sit in the interview weeks earlier, because he'd learned that people who were lying tended to fill silence with more lies, and people who weren't tended to just wait. Patricia filled it. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with looking out for someone. I understand family situations are complicated. She's not family, Daniel said. She's an employee. Same as Ruiz, same as everyone in that pod. And the data in front of you isn't about her specifically. It's about a pattern that includes at least 2 people, and a review process that you personally sign off on. Patricia's composure held for another few seconds, and then began, very slightly, to slip. I've run that department for 6 years without a single formal complaint. You have 6 years without a formal complaint, Daniel said, because people were afraid to file one. That's in the survey data too, if you'd like to read it. He did not raise his voice. He had never once, in 5 years of running that company, raised his voice at an employee, because he understood that volume was usually a substitute for a weak argument, and his arguments, when he made them, did not need substitutes. I'm placing you on administrative leave effective today, pending a formal review by Human Resources, Daniel said. Marcus Webb will walk you through the process. This isn't a termination. It's a review, and it will be conducted the same way every review in this building is conducted, on the facts. Patricia opened her mouth to argue, and then, watching Daniel's face, seemed to understand that there was nothing in it left to argue with. She had built her defense on the assumption that this conversation was about favoritism toward Vanessa, and Daniel had just quietly, methodically, taken that ground away from her by refusing to let the argument live anywhere but the data itself. She left the office considerably smaller than she'd entered it. The formal review took 3 weeks. It confirmed everything the initial data had suggested and added detail that made it worse. Patricia had on 2 occasions quietly redirected marketing budget allocated to underperforming accounts toward client entertainment expenses for the accounts run by her favored coordinators, dressing the reallocation up in language vague enough to survive a casual audit but not a thorough one. It wasn't large money. It was, Marcus said when he brought Daniel the final report, the kind of small, quiet dishonesty that metastasizes precisely because nobody imagines a client relations manager is worth investigating that closely. Patricia Ames was terminated for cause. She did not contest it publicly, which told its own story. Vanessa found out about the change in leadership the way most of the pod did, through an all-staff email announcing a reorganization, new reporting lines, and an open call for interested internal candidates to apply for the newly vacant department lead position. She did not apply. She told herself she hadn't earned that kind of trust yet, not from this company, and certainly not from the men who ran it. And she went back to her desk and kept doing the work in front of her the way she had, for the last 3 months, carefully, honestly, without asking anyone in the building for anything they hadn't already decided to give her. It was Ruiz, the other coordinator, who had absorbed the department's hard accounts alongside her, who mentioned it to her over coffee one afternoon. He'd been the one to file the anonymous survey comment that had first caught Marcus Webb's attention, and he told Vanessa, in the plain way of someone who had nothing to gain from flattering her, that her work over the past 3 months had been the most consistent in the pod. And that not applying for the lead role because of pride would be a strange way to thank a company that had actually looked at the evidence instead of the rumor. She applied on the last day of the posting window. She was not the only candidate. There were 2 others, both with longer tenures at the firm, both well regarded by their departments. The interview panel this time included 2 directors from client services, 1 representative from human resources, and at the end of the process, a final conversation with the chief executive himself, which was standard for any director-level hire, regardless of who the candidate happened to be. Daniel walked into that final conversation having read her file 3 times, the way he read everything that mattered, and having decided somewhere in those 3 readings exactly how he intended to treat the fact that this candidate had once been his wife. He treated it the same way he'd treated her original hire, as a fact that existed, and a fact that changed nothing about the standard he was going to hold her to. "Your work over the last quarter has been strong," he said once they were seated. "The client retention numbers on the accounts you inherited from Pod 2 are up 8% since the transition. That's not something I'd expect from someone who was by every account buried under an unfair workload for 3 months." "I didn't do it to prove anything," Vanessa said. "I know," Daniel said. "That's exactly why it counts." He asked her about her vision for the department, how she'd handle a team that had just been through a leadership scandal, how she'd rebuild trust with coordinators who had spent months watching favoritism go unpunished. Her answers were plain and specific, free of the corporate language that candidates sometimes reached for when they didn't have real substance underneath it. And Daniel listened, the way he always listened, watching for the gap between the story and the paperwork. There wasn't one this time either. "I'll be honest with you about something," Daniel said near the end, setting his pen down the way he had the first day she'd sat across from him. "If I give you this role, people in this building are going to say it's because of who you were to me. Some of them already think that about the fact that you're still employed here at all." "I know," Vanessa said. "That means the standard I hold you to has to be higher than the one I'd hold anyone else to, not lower. Not because it's fair to you, because it's the only way this decision survives, being questioned, and because it's the only way I can live with making it." "I wouldn't want it any other way," Vanessa said, and she meant it in a way that surprised her slightly, as the words left her mouth, because 5 years ago she wouldn't have understood why a person would choose the harder standard when an easier one was sitting right there for the taking. She got the role. The committee's recommendation had ranked her first among the 3 candidates on the strength of her retention numbers and her interviews, and Daniel's approval when it came was a formality built on a process that had never once bent in her favor, only around her the way water closes around a stone without changing course because of it. He told her as much. Plainly, the day the offer went out, "You earned this on a clean process. I want you to know that, and I want you to know I know it, because I don't think either of us needs to wonder about it later." She started as department lead. 6 weeks. After that conversation, it was not in the months that followed. The story of 2 people finding their way back to each other, not quickly, and not in any way either of them announced to the building. Daniel remained precisely as careful with her as he was with every other director who reported, at several removes, into his office. He did not schedule extra meetings with her. He did not soften feedback on her department's quarterly numbers when a client complaint required addressing head-on. He held the line, the same line he'd held from the very first day she sat shaking in his office with a resume in her hands. Because the line, he understood now more clearly than he ever had, was the entire point of who he'd become. What did change, slowly over the better part of a year, was smaller than any of that. Vanessa began asking, tentatively at first, whether she might see Ellie. Daniel did not agree right away. He talked to a family therapist about it, the same one Ellie had seen briefly after the divorce, to help her understand why her mother wasn't in the house anymore, and he let the process be exactly as slow and careful as everything else he did. The first visit was 30 minutes. In a public park, with Daniel a short distance away, closer to a watchful presence than a participant. Ellie was shy at first, and then curious, and then, in the particular unguarded way of an 8-year-old who has not yet learned to hold a grudge the way adults do, simply a kid talking to a woman about a school project, unburdened by history she was too young to fully carry. It grew from there, slowly, the way Daniel had built everything else in his life. Visits became more frequent. Trust, when it came in small increments that neither of them tried to rush. On a Saturday morning, nearly a year after Vanessa had first walked into his office with a shaking resume, Daniel stood in his kitchen, the good kitchen now, in the house he'd bought 2 years into his climb, pouring coffee into 2 mugs instead of 1, out of a habit that had quietly become routine. Ellie sat at the table finishing a bowl of cereal, telling her mother, who sat across from her, about a science project involving a volcano that had, predictably, made a mess of the kitchen table the week before. Daniel set 1 mug down in front of Vanessa without being asked, the way you'd set it down for anyone who belonged in that kitchen, and she looked up at him, and something passed between them that wasn't quite forgiveness and wasn't quite anything that needed a name yet either. It was, if anything, closer to the quiet structural kind of trust Daniel had spent his whole life building things out of. Not loud, not declared. Just tested and tested again, and found each time to hold. He sat down across from his daughter, and the 3 of them stayed at that table a while longer, in a kitchen that had come a long way from 1 working burner and $240, built, every inch of it, on the simple, unglamorous discipline of a man who had never once, in 5 hard years, been willing to cut a corner just because no one was looking.